My name is Kathy Hart. I'm the Senior Curator of Collections and the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming at the Hood Museum of Art. That latter title indicates that a major part of my job during the last 28 years I've been at the museum is integrating collections for the purposes of teaching into the curriculum. So one of the things that, in light of some of the conversations this morning about environmentally oriented art and photography and bringing the discussion forward, I think museums can be a place for discussion and conversations with the public where some of that work intersects. And they do have an obligation to fulfill that role. And one of the things I will talk about today is some of the ways we're doing that. In this session, we'll be hearing from two artists whose work in photography deals with earth extraction stories and impacts in the Southwest U.S. and Southern and Northern Plains, respectively. The first speaker, Will Wilson, is a Diné photographer who spent his formative years living in the Navajo Nation. He received his MFA in photography at the University of New Mexico and has held visiting professorships at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Oberlin College, and the University of Arizona. From 2009 to 2012, Wilson managed the National Vision Project, a Ford Foundation-funded initiative at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe, and helped coordinate the New Mexico Arts Temporary Installations Made for Environment time program on the Navajo Nation. Recently, Wilson completed an exhibition and artist residency at the Denver Art Museum and received the King Fellow Artist in Residency in 2013 at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Since 2014, he's been the head of the photography program at Santa Fe Community College. The session's second speaker, Terry Evans, is a photographer raised in Kansas who has focused much of her work, if not all of it, on the relationship of humans to the rural landscape, and most recently also the urban landscape in her series on Chicago. Her interest in photographing both people and the environment started early in her career and aligned with her personal concerns as an environmental activist. As early as 1970, she helped start the Salina, Kansas Consumers for a Better Environment, and also took an interest on issues of poverty and social inequity. Her career has been centered on portraying both human and natural landscape, and her work has been the subject of recent solo exhibitions at the Amon Carter Museum, the North Dakota Museum of Art, and the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. In 1996, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship. Before these talks commence, just move the slide forward. I wanted to talk about the Hood Museums of Art's commitment to building and teaching with a collection on environmental art and photography. The portrayal of humans' impact on the earth has been a significant area of exploration for many contemporary photographers and artists. The first unforgettable image of Earth from space, taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968, revealed the fragility and beauty of the planet, and soon became the signature image of an emerging environmental movement. What followed was a renewed interest in photographing endangered wildernesses and landscapes, as well as the irrevocable alterations to the Earth's environment. Through these images and activism by environmentalists and scientists, we become increasingly aware of the accelerating rate of human consumption of nature's finite resources, as well as the impact of industrial pollution and extraction on our lives and future. I and my former student intern here at Dartmouth and co-curator Kenji Prapipat Mongkol, now a curatorial fellow at MoCA Chicago, wrote these words back in 2013 as an introduction to an exhibition of environmental photography titled Looking Back at Earth. In rereading these words this past week, and I just read them to you, it struck me how the general awareness of environmental issues has changed in the last 5 years. Climate change and its effects have become a central part of our everyday lives, and if possible, the stakes have become even higher, the conversation more urgent, particularly in the current political climate in the U.S. Within the world of museums and of art and activism, just in the last 2 years, exhibitions with the word Anthropocene in their title have been organized at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Harn Museum, and the Norton Museum of Art, the latter two both in Florida. An academic museum such as the Hood seeks to be relevant to its campus, students, faculty, and larger community, not only by its engagement with the curriculum, but also with the contemporary issues, with contemporary issues and ideas. The Hood has long been known for the integration of its collections into teaching, and it was only around 2007 that we began to address a lack of images and art engaged with environmental issues. In 2007, Dartmouth hosted the Arctic Science Summit Week, an annual gathering of international organizations involved in Arctic research. This annual gathering, which Ross Virginia, who spoke earlier, brought together. In this annual gathering is designed to strengthen collaborations across academia, government agencies, local communities, industry, non-governmental organizations, and other Arctic stakeholders. At that time, the Hood, in working with Professor Virginia, did exhibitions of contemporary art from Nunavut and of the Hood's Arctic collections, looking at issues of climate change through the lenses of those two exhibitions, and also the work of photographer and activist Shubhankar Banerjee from his Arctic series, Oil in the Geese, Oil in the Caribou, and Oil in the Whales. It became apparent to us that this was an important area for future collecting. We began to add works of environmentally engaged photography and art to this collection at that time and continue to do so today, wanting to expand the conversation and also expand the voices that we were bringing into the collection and thus into our teaching. The photographs we collected were by artists and documentary photographers who are deeply concerned with drawing attention to pressing environmental problems, including sustainability, climate change, and pollution. These images do not often explicitly elucidate these ideas, but instead shed light upon and draw attention to landscapes that have been threatened or adversely affected by actions of government, corporations, and individuals. And increasingly, we want to also look at people who are also threatened by those issues, by those entities. Taken together, they overturn the romanticized notion of nature, forming instead a kaleidoscopic archive that documents the complexity of disparate but interconnected natural, human, industrial ecosystems. The 2013 exhibition, Looking Back at Earth, that we did, took this growing collection and organized them into the following themes: consumption and waste, industrial impact, density, Arctic tracks, sustainable, unsustainable, and powering the future. One of the reasons we did Powering the Future, and included the work of Virginia Bien, who's in the audience, was that we spoke to students and they wanted not only sort of photographs of all the problems, but also looking at possible solutions and ways forward, not always looking at what the problem was, but possibly how the problem could be addressed. The acquisition of many of these works was prompted by interests of undergraduates at Dartmouth College, and 3 of the photographs by Daniel Beltra, J. Henry Fair, and Ian Tay were chosen for the collections by students in the Hood's extracurricular course Museum Collecting 101. In addition, the Hood asked 6 students who had taken courses in environmental studies and geography here at Dartmouth to write panels on exhibition themes in relationship to 6 of the photographs on display. Their texts introduced such subjects as coal ash slurry pits and glass versus plastic bottles, with informed arguments about the science and environmental impacts behind these images. The conversations and discussions have been centered on these new collections, have been fruitful and impactful. I'm showing you a few images of courses in geography, environmental studies, and engineering that have used these works. Oops, and this is more of the exhibition, excuse me. Environmental policy, geography, environmental studies, and engineering that have used these works as springboards for conversations and close looking, obviously, about environmental writing, policy, and the need for possible solutions for change. The last 2 images are of students in the museums. We're about to reopen a new building at the end of January with 3 new object study rooms for teaching. So the last 2 images are of students in the museum's new object study spaces. when the hood reopens, we will be bringing these works out of storage again, and hope to add more work from artists in this particular symposium in particular. Add more work to the collection as we move forward to make them accessible for future students in courses at Dartmouth. It is in this context that we invited Will Wilson and Terry Evans to speak, as their work will extend our collections in this area. Now I invite you to welcome Will Wilson, who will talk about his AIR series that addresses contamination of Diné lands by the effects of uranium mining. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, to the Dartmouth community, I guess, for bringing me out here and for showing up, and for being here to, I guess, get inspired. That's really why I'm here, and to talk a little bit about some of my work and my projects. So we're talking about change, and kind of change that happens, I guess, relatively quickly, right? So I've been starting my lectures recently with this image because in the foreground, the young girl, I imagine she's about 10 there. That's my mother. And a lot has shifted in maybe, I don't know, 60 years. This was probably shot in the mid-50s. And they were on their way to the trading post in Tuba City, Arizona, from their summer sheep camp. And that is literally how they got around, So I was thinking about, the irony of coming to talk about kind of decolonizing the Anthropocene or nature or whatever we're discussing right now, and flying and driving to get here, and the carbon kind of footprint and impact that might lead to. But they had less of an impact, I think, and kind of understood that. So this image was a kind of constructed image, right? And so they were kind of met by this guy, Ray Manley, who is an editorial photographer based in Tucson, Arizona, and he asked them to kind of draw water from this source by the side of the road. They were well provisioned for their trip, and I think my family was relatively wealthy in terms of kind of Navajo standards. But that's not what this says. That's not what this image tells the story about. It's more about scarcity and poverty and people kind of, in an interesting, I think, relationship to their environment. But anywho, another image, this is Joel Sternfeld, and it's from his American Prospects image, and I'm very grateful for him for capturing this and for his kind of vision to capture this. This is a uranium processing mill. This was shot somewhere between 77 and 88, and it's about 4 miles from Tuba City, Arizona, which is the community that I grew up in. Twanestizi is the way that you refer to it in Navajo, and it's about the name in Navajo means water is twa, and everything kind of out there is named kind of based on water, right? So water is particularly important in a very arid environment, but it's kind of where the water is seeping from the earth, right? And so this uranium processing mill, kind of euphemistically named Rare Metals, was the one really cool kind of post-industrial space that teenagers could hang out, make mischief, spray paint and stuff. And so I grew up like going to this place, hanging out, and now it's a super fun site. And in the background there is, those are uranium tailings. We used to come home covered in that stuff, and not so healthy, I guess. But I've got a cold right now, but luckily I've been spared that. So I'm just thankful that this still exists, because this image, that stuff is torn down and now it's covered with that, right? So that's the rare metals site now, and it's the EPA Navajo Nation Superfund site. And it's been encased and kind of entombed. But this is Tuba City, Arizona. It's only 4 miles away. One thing to note is, there's no pointer on this thing, but there's a kind of important water source there. And right now, what the EPA is trying to do is figure out whether or not, it's leaching into the groundwater or not, and if that's going to affect, the drinking water for everybody. And, it's already affected, I think, the environment for the animals, the livestock that people depend on in that region. So my work is kind of, in some ways largely informed by this history. This is an EPA map. They're doing kind of remediation right now, between, I don't know, 42 and in the late 80s when the uranium kind of market collapsed. It was kind of the Wild West and like boom kind of resource extraction space. Some of the, well, much of the fissile material that was gathered, for the development of the nuclear weapons in Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project times, as well as, in the build-up to the Cold War, came from the Southwest United States. A lot of it from indigenous kind of nation spaces, right? And this is an image of 521 mines that have been assessed, that exist, and many of them are very close to communities. I grew up in Tuba, just out here, past those hotspots is where my family has their summer and winter sheep camps. And so there's this remediation project going on, but contamination is very much an issue on the reservation, on the Navajo Nation. So I don't know. I think maps are interesting too. I think, some of my kind of future projects that I think I'm kind of gathering information on will be based on kind of revisiting or mapping and kind of going to these different sites and imaging them photographically. Another thing that kind of informs this kind of nuclear apocalypse that's kind of occurred, I think, in the West, on the Navajo Nation is this. Not many people are familiar with this, but the Church Rock uranium mill spill that happened in 1979, when the United Nuclear Corporation's Church Rock uranium tailings disposal pond, it breached a dam, and you can kind of see it kind of moving out that way west and south towards Gallup, New Mexico, and then on to the Navajo Nation. So this pond breached, and it released over 1,000 tons of solid radioactive mill waste and 93 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings. The solution flowed into the Puerco River, and contaminants traveled 80 miles downstream to Navajo County, Arizona. And it's frequently described as kind of releasing more radioactivity than 3 Mile Island, right, which is kind of the nation's most well-known kind of nuclear disaster. So kind of given that context a little bit, I was initially kind of drawn to photography and just kind of the power of its kind of storytelling capabilities and process, in part because I'm Navajo and I'm also Irish and Welsh, so I kind of grew up between these two places and spaces. And I'm not a native speaker of Navajo. It's close to me. I understand the rhythms of it, and when I'm in the context, I can kind of suss out kind of living in translation what's going on in day-to-day events. But photography really became like a way of self-expression, and a way that I could kind of share my subjectivity in relation to what I was seeing and going on. Because I think something that kind of undergirds a lot of the work that I do is this idea or this thought about how oral culture kind of communicates history, information, subjectivity through language, and how important the construction of a world is kind of through language. And for Navajo, that's particularly important. But that within the context of oral cultures, representation is particularly important, right? Photography, for me, has always been this kind of magic process because of how well it indexes, and describes something, and how many, how that meaning can be shifted and transformed given, the viewer's relationship to it and, who's telling the story. But I think something else that I'll get to in a little bit is that kind of given that power and given that kind of understanding of orality, maybe, that those sayings that the Hollywood kind of description of the Native American being afraid of having their soul stolen by the camera, actually has some real weight, right? And it's based on this understanding of the power of such an indexically specific way to represent something, right? There's power in that. And it's that power that people were kind of suspicious of and skeptical about. Because I think within that context, you can also think of it another way, you can actually image something into reality. You can bring maybe or imagine something good happening, and it will. So, there's just power in that, and it's something that kind of is philosophically, I think, undergirding my practice and my engagement with photography in general. Early on, these are images from my undergrad work at Oberlin College. I started thinking about how to use photography to kind of build environments, and so installation became an important kind of aspect to my work, and that I wanted to kind of contextualize the way that the viewer receives these images and understands them. I also think that, I was also thinking a lot about the problematic nature of the way that Native cultures have been represented photographically, historically, right, through anthropological or ethnographic kind of lenses. So this is the project, the autoimmune response project, that kind of, I think, derived from that understanding of, an environment kind of in distress, and that change has occurred, and because of that, there's been this kind of dis-ease and response necessary to kind of move forward, right? So in the autoimmune response work, the title is telling, autoimmune diseases are diseases that disproportionately affect Native communities in a lot of ways, diabetes is one of the kind of most kind of commonly understood one. And, if you think of indigenous communities as kind of sentinel populations, right, where these canaries in the coal mine, we share this common coal mine, but the effects have kind of happened quickest to us, and we're responding in a bad way, right? But also, it's about the response, right? So it's not just the autoimmune disease; it's the autoimmune response. So how do you kind of reclaim agency, understand what's going on, and then move forward in the context of that? So the series opens with this kind of panoramic kind of vision of a West, and I don't know if you can see, but there's a nuclear test cloud kind of brought in there digitally. It's also, I think, something about, thinking about surveys of the American West, and just how that absence in a lot of those images, the absence of anybody kind of indigenous to those spaces as this kind of surveying process moved forward throughout the West. So this series follows kind of on a sci-fi line, this protagonist, the autoimmune response protagonist, who's played by me, so it's kind of, I get to be a little bit performative in this series. And he's trying to figure out what's going on, why the world has become toxic to him, and how he might kind of survive, reintegrate, figure out what's going on. And so this is an image of the Little Colorado and Colorado River confluence. And it's shot from the Navajo Nation side, and, the north and south rim of the Grand Canyon are on the horizon there. So just in terms of the narrative, he finds shelter, right? A customary kind of architectural form, the hogan, becomes like his site of sanctuary and respite. You know, he re-energizes in this space, and also kind of starts to do research about how to move forward and make, you know, make a living in this new strange world. So there's reference in some of these images to the hero twins and the Navajo creation story. So there's Board of Water and Monster Slayer, who are two kind of mythological figures who make the world habitable for this kind of iteration of the world, for the human kind of space. And they do that by defeating these different monsters that make the world habitable, right? And so in some of this, I'm also kind of mixing that metaphor or that idea of a monster as being, you know, the toxic kind of evocation that we brought forth by bringing out this stuff from the ground. I don't know if this is actually in the Navajo creation story, but I've heard this reference colloquially on a lot of different levels in a lot of different places. Like my brother, my cousin brother, your first cousins, your maternal first cousins in Navajo are your brothers and sisters. Same word, right? So he's like an apprentice medicine person, right? He's learning all the songs and stuff. So I've kind of checked in with him, and he's like, I don't know if that's real or not. but I've heard other people say it. And so, you know, when we pray, and this action or activity in a lot of those photographs is offering corn pollen to the earth, right? And so corn pollen is this kind of beautiful, life-giving substance, right? And so that's why we use it in ceremony and to offer to the world. But it's this yellow powder, right? And it's actually very similar kind of in composition in the way that it looks to uranium powder, right? Which is hitso, right? Which is this yellow dirt. And I've heard that, you know, humans were given a choice at some point. You can either choose the tadadin, which is this life-giving force, or you can take this litso, which is really powerful, kind of energetic kind of thing, but maybe not so sustainable. But whichever one you choose, you leave the other one alone, right? And so we're doing both, unfortunately. And it's not ending well for folks. So, you know, this narrative goes on, and by the end, you know, to kind of survive in the post-apocalyptic world, you're going to have to create habitation, right? And so he models his hogan or house out of the one that he was in previous that he found. So he builds one. And so in this iteration of the exhibition, you know, and this is an ongoing project, and it's got many evolutions and it's kind of transmedia in some ways. But it started in 2004, but this was the first exhibit of it. You got to kind of see this kind of strange panoptic form in the center of the gallery, and go in there and kind of experience the architecture of it. And then the big photographs were on the outside, right? And so just some background stills of the construction and creation of this, some research. Weaving, which is an important customary practice in Dene or Navajo culture, is something that I've always been kind of fascinated with and interested in. My family, you know, my grandmother had probably like 300 or 400 head of sheep. And so I remember her you know, sustaining basically our family and our extended family with this important resource. But so the kind of evolution of this, so architecture becomes important and a sheltering space, and then you have to eat in the new apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic world, right? And so it becomes a greenhouse, and the greenhouse kind of functions as this research facility and incubator to kind of hopefully grow maybe on a little more industrial scale and become like this terraforming project where indigenous food species and this technology that's been developed over kind of, millennia really, that's situated for that environment is kind of repropagated and then spread back into the world. So this is the shift where I was talking a little bit about like, kind of orality coming into photography, coming into maybe imagining possibilities for a future that is, like important, powerful, and proactive. So I do have this dream of like this becoming a reality and like some kind of exchange between elders who actually have a living memory of working with this material. And then younger people to come in who are, Chad was talking about middle schoolers who are growing up like in the age of the Anthropocene and how that's normal, right? But maybe this is a way to kind of speak back against that kind of stuff. So a little more on that. This series in practice is kind of shifting. I'm also interested in kind of photography as a medium for kind of telling stories and the history of photography. So, Christina was talking about daguerreotype. A little bit after that, maybe the third photographic technology is wet plate collodion, the tin type. You're making your own emulsions. But so this is kind of a blend of kind of histories of photography. And it's about kind of considering invasive species just downriver from Los Alamos National Laboratories. So I think something else that I'm kind of trying to play with in this is time or the future, past, present, kind of remembering the future. And, using that as a way to kind of use this body of work as a cautionary tale as well as maybe a way to like imagine or think out of this process or project that we're all engaged in. So this is the confluence of 3 generations. This is back at that really amazing site. My mother, myself, and my daughter are kind of now the actors in this. And I want to come back to this project, very soon, potentially this summer, and kind of start bringing in other kind of community members and expand this narrative a little bit. But definitely make it a little more intergenerational, right? So I think that's kind of an important thing. Something else that I think of, like in relation to this kind of thinking about eco-criticality and aesthetics, and maybe like bringing ethics back into this idea of aesthetics, is notions of beauty in relation to into Navajo, or just the way that kind of the world is framed, and there's this kind of underpinning philosophical idea in Navajo, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's Sa Nagai Bikahajo, and it just means basically to live in beauty, but part of that is, or to live in harmony or in balance, is definitely this kind of understanding that, like, we have to, our environment is something that is an essential kind of part of that, like, but I think that somehow customary practice, like historical customary practice and, kind of aesthetic production of things, like naturally has that embedded within it as well. This is a weaving, a kind of recreation of a weaving that my grandmother, Martha at City, put together. And we re-wove it out of glass beads, so 4 millimeter glass beads. We, just had a kind of a material pixel. They're square glass beads. But we had QR codes embedded in our design. That was the kind of shift, right? And I think I might just leave you with a couple of videos. And one of them will be this, and then I'll show another one because we wove a different version of that. All right, well, I'm just noticing that I don't want to take up too much time. I want to leave time for everybody else. So I'm going to just leave it with that one because I like that piece. But thank you very much.
So maybe you got this already, but he said that scan takes you to that movie. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I can see it here, but, oh, there it is. Okay. And could we lower the lights some, please? Hi. I'm very honored to be here and to be in the midst of such creative people, both the scholars and the artists. I don't even know if I could distinguish between the two. I guess not really. So I want to start with a project that I began in 1978. 40 years ago. And then we'll see where we go. I'm not going to show you everything I've done in the last 50 years, don't worry. So in 1978, I had already been photographing for about 10 years. And then, and I was not the least bit interested in landscape. It seemed quite boring to me. I thought Ansel Adams was boring. Actually, I kind of still do. And my friend Wes Jackson, who was the director of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, where I live, asked me to help him to photograph some research that he was doing. He was looking at an untouched, intact native prairie a virgin prairie. It had never been plowed or pastured. It was 80 acres, and it was just north of our town, Salina. And he was working with his interns, and they were looking at, he was looking for companion planting. He was trying to figure out a structure for a natural systems agriculture, something that would break away from a monoculture, which was an entirely different thing, which was simply exhausting the soil. He was looking for a way to plant polycultural perennial grains. So I went out to this prairie, and I photographed his research, which was laying down meter square grids and doing plant counts. And while they were working, I wandered around and I started looking at the ground. And it was extraordinary. It was so different from my front yard, for example, which was just bluegrass. And I could stand and look at the ground for an hour and not see everything just at my feet. So I started photographing the ground, and I thought at the time that maybe if I photographed long enough and looked hard enough, I would begin to see the structure of the universe, because this was the first time I had seen an untouched ecosystem. And I figured this structure, this biological structure, must surely have something to do with everything else. And then I started reading. I read about Plains Indians' medicinal uses of plants. I read about grass systematics. I read all the fiction I could find about prairie. And I read Willa Cather, I read Maurice Sandoz. And I particularly ran into the writing of Gregory Bateson, anthropologist, who wrote about the pattern that connects. And he talked about what pattern connects the crab to the lobster and the orchid to the primrose, and all four of them to me. And I thought that was exactly what I was looking for, too. And so he was a great inspiration to me. I was photographing in black and white at waist level. I never photographed when the sun was out, or I at least tried to make a very even light, because I wanted to be seeing the structure. I didn't want to be seeing patterns of light and dark. I wanted to be seeing the actual patterns of the prairie. And then I realized that I needed more information, so I started working in color. And then I realized one day, as I was, that I saw these sage stars on the ground, and I realized, the sky is part of the prairie too. And I started raising my camera up. This is a fairy ring that is caused by fungus underground. You may already know this. And the fungus, sometimes the ring expands, sometimes it breaks apart. But it's quite extraordinary to see it. And I want you to keep this fairy ring in mind. I then started wondering what the prairie would look like from above. Would I see the same sort of shapes and patterns? This sort of, is it really as above, so below? Is the micro the same as the macro? And I discovered, yes, it was this very, very sensuous kind of form that I was seeing from above as well. So I photographed this prairie and other prairies for about 8 years until I finally just simply ran out of ways to see it photographically. I didn't fall out of love with it. I just ran out of ways to photograph it. And I continued then to photograph human marks on the prairie, because at one point, a friend of mine, colleague Philip Goin, told me about a Pacific island where nuclear testing had been done, and they would put the nuclear trash in this mound and then cover it up with concrete. And the military, the soldiers, had put a red cone in the center of this mound, and then they had painted a circle around it, because that reminded them of a woman's breast. It makes me mad even now when I tell you this. And so that made me realize that I was photographing only this, in a way I was just photographing the breast. And so I needed to look at the whole of the prairie, the whole damaged, marked on, human invaded prairie, and not just at this intact ecosystem. So that's what I've been doing ever since. I put this in just as a kind of tribute to Ross and Christina, because I spent a short time in Greenland and working in response to some scientific work being done at the University of Kansas. This was in 2008, and it was the Center for Remote Sensing of Ice Sheets. So they were doing related work to what Ross is doing. They were except that they were working more from, so what is a word for unmanned that doesn't use the word man? What? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. They were using, not that I don't like men, but I'm just trying to be correct. What? Yeah, probably. Yeah. Sorry, really sorry. So they were photographing from above, but what they were collecting was data, and data that was not visual images. I was trying to understand the glacier. This was the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland. They and I were working out of Ilulissat. And I'm sure you probably know this because we've already seen so many pictures of glacial melt, but that green is simply the right color, and that's because of minerals, ancient minerals that have melted. Is that right, Ross? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So anyway, that was simply to say how much I appreciated the work that Christina and Ross are doing. All right, now I'm taking you to North Dakota, and this is much, much later. This is in 2011. My friend and colleague, writer Elizabeth Farnsworth, and I decided to see what was happening in the oil boom. I'm not showing you many other projects that I did that all had some connection to prairie, and but from a small town in Kansas to botanical and animal specimens and bird specimens collected on the prairies and plains. Everything I had done had some reference to prairie. But we heard about the oil boom in North Dakota in 2011 when we met in Minot, Minnesota. Elizabeth lives in Berkeley, and we made 5 trips to North Dakota and explored what was happening there. The very first day we met Scott Davis and his brother, who had a ranch, and the green part that this land is on their ranch. The green part is pristine prairie. It has been grazed, but managed beautifully. It's a beautiful, rich landscape. So what happens in North Dakota, as you probably know, is that mineral rights are separate from surface rights. So the Davis family owned the surface rights, but they had not been able to afford to buy the mineral rights. So there was a conglomerate of people who owned the mineral rights underground, and they leased those to the oil company, which then had the right to come in whenever they wanted to and wherever they wanted to and cut the fences and go in and drill. So that's what's happening here. This is an oil pad that's just about to be fracked. This is Alexei, who was teaching at the college in Minot. He had come from Russia, and we invited him out to look at the Davis property because it was so rich. He hadn't even ever been that far west in North Dakota. So there he is collecting specimens on the Davis Ranch property. You can see how rich it is. Just see the variety. So he was collecting specimens, which then we saw later and used a few in our exhibition. We later had an exhibition at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. This is Scott Davis, very angry about what was happening to his land, and very torn. This is his daughter, Sarah. Sarah went away to college, as did two other children. They came home and there was no work for them in North Dakota. So they started working for the oil company. And so Scott was torn. Does he get to keep his children there and lose the prairie? Or does he even have a choice? He didn't even really have a choice. So his children are there now. The oil company's still there. They've built their homes on his ranch land. This is his granddaughter. This is Sarah's daughter. And so the story goes on from generation to generation, and the oil is still being pumped out of North Dakota. So this is a pipeline right-of-way that's coming from an oil pad over the hill. This is another image that makes me furious because there it is, just dug right across the prairie. The land has no voice, like the parrots have no voice that we pay any attention to. So there it is, and there's one out of every that comes from every oil pad that's been drilled in North Dakota, which I meant to see exactly how many there are now, and I'm not sure, but it's somewhere around 30 to 40,000, but we have to, I will look that up more carefully. When we were there were 216 oil rigs in North Dakota. The oil rig is the big sort of central thing that employs about 125 people. This is the waste dump site from that area. This is where they would dump the waste. You can judge the scale of it. You can see cars up in the right-hand corner. This is Nelson. Nelson lives on the Berthold Reservation. Unlike Standing Rock, many people on the Berthold Reservation, which is it's called the 3 affiliated tribes, live there. And the Mandan, Hidatsa, and the Arikara. And many people I talked to, everyone I talked to, did want oil on their land. They were very, very poor, and having an oil well on their property gave them real income. So, so this is the tension. This is the tension that we all face in this whole room. Are we going to quit driving? Are we going to quit flying to conferences? What are we going to do about this? In many ways, I think we all deal every day with the same thing that Scott Davis and Nelson deals with. What are the trade-offs? So that was one project I did. When I got done with that project, I realized that I could no longer simply just be telling stories of the prairie as I had been, but I had to take a stand for the prairie itself. You know, it already had shown me what it is, and it was time that instead of just observing and showing my pictures, I needed to do something more. You know, we need to start keeping the oil in the ground. We need to try to understand what that ground is. So when I got back to Chicago, after I finished this project, I called the Natural Resource Defense Council and said, you know, what are you working on that's really important right in the Chicago area? And they told me about the pet coke issue on the south side of Chicago. So pet coke, as you may know, is petroleum coke. It's the dirtiest oil is mined, of course, in the tar sands of Alberta, and then it's shipped down to various refineries. The closest one to us in Chicago is at Whiting, and it's the BP refinery. So the oil is refined there, and the waste material is pet coke. Pet coke is burned as fuel in the dirtiest kind of manufacturing. It's not even allowed to be burned in most places in the United States. It's shipped off to India and China and other places. And it, at that time, which was 2014, it was being shipped by rail over to southeast Chicago and stored in big piles, big uncovered piles along the Calumet River in the middle of the neighborhood that formerly had housed steel workers. But when the steel industry had collapsed, many of the steel workers had left because there was no work there. And we had many immigrants from Mexico, and most of that neighborhood now was, those people were the residents. This train going through filled with pet coke is going across the site of an old steel mill. Wait, I want to go back to that one a minute. So as I said, I'll show you a picture of these piles later, but I just want you to know right off that the piles, the storage site was owned by the infamous Koch brothers. Figures. And I'm going to show you a few of the activists. So I went over to a community meeting of the activists on the southeast side, and this was a small group of, I don't know, 10 to 15 people, grassroots people who lived right there, and I joined them. I joined the group. I could not be of them. I didn't live there. I wasn't suffering the damage that they were suffering. What would happen is the pet coke would blow off of the piles into the neighborhood, and it would coat people's cars and their sidewalks, and of course their lungs. And it's this kind of greasy stuff that it looks like you're holding a handful of loose coal until you try to get it off your hand, and then it's all greasy. This is Jim Kenney. He and I became good friends. He's a retired steel and construction worker, and he offered to introduce me to the neighborhood. And so he went with me a lot of times when I photographed over there, and he's a very avid and energetic activist. This is Anna Johnson, who was also, she was concerned about pet coke. She was also concerned about the Agrifine factory there that makes animal feed, and it makes it from animal byproducts and vegetation. It emits a terrible odor. I mean, just terrible. As Anna said, you know, it's worse than smelling death. And so people can't have their windows open. So this whole area is an industrial corridor that we feel has been pretty much abandoned by the city of Chicago. It's become kind of a dumping ground for dirty industry. This is Sam Corona, another activist he works for the Southeast Environmental Task Force, which has their office there on the southeast side. So the southeast side of Chicago is very close to the Indiana border. You know, and then if you go a little east, you're right at Lake Michigan. Here's what the pile looks like. So those are water cannons that were installed after community pressure, but they didn't really damp it down. In fact, you can kind of see how they're blowing, and they weren't effective. The pet coke still blew. Well, through intense pressure from the local activists and from the Natural Resource Defense Council, the BP quit shipping it there. The Koch brothers sold the site. It was a success, except that now a concrete recycling plant is moving in. You can imagine how much dust that's going to make. So, you know, so the story goes on, and local people are still fighting to now they're also fighting. There is a manganese factory there that emits fumes, and manganese is a neurotoxin. So, you know, there's a continuous battle going on there. So when I finished that work, and by the way, I really like this picture. I think it's a beautiful picture. It looks like hell itself, it seems to me. At least how I would imagine hell. I don't know yet. I'm so humble. So when I finished that work, which was a few years ago, I thought that I needed to see beauty again. And I felt that I needed to revisit the prairie, the intact prairie. And so I started visiting some places in northern Indiana. And so, but I didn't know what to do with the pictures. And I visited this little place. This is a little prairie in northern Indiana. The caretaker will not allow me to even say the name because these are very fragile places, and he doesn't want people going there, and I respect that. So I visited once, and I made all these prints, and they were all really beautiful, but so what? So I thought, well, maybe if I put them together, they'll be more interesting. So I did that, but it was still kind of so what? And so, so then I went back into it, and I started layering it more. Let me see if I can remember where the... Okay. So you can see where I inserted other pieces in layers. And I started overlapping pieces. I put a piece in here, and I put a piece in here, and in here. And I wanted to get closer, and I quit making the edges meet evenly. I put a piece in there. I wanted to get closer to the way it really feels to look at land like this, to look at ground like this, the kind of layering of information. And then I went back in January to another prairie that was nearby. This one is on the edge of a cemetery. It's less than 2 acres. And then I started doing even more. I started kind of blending together parts of them. I wanted, and I still want the edges of the frame to be clear, because this is about looking closely. It's not about having one sort of generalized view. It's about looking here and then looking here and looking here and looking here, and spending the time that is really required to actually see an untouched ecosystem, and how incredible that we still have these places that we can learn from. This is one I was talking to a few of you earlier. This is dune and swale. And so this is not actually prairie. This is near the sand dunes, near the Indiana sand dunes. And so there's a lot of wet areas, and there's this ridge that is a little higher that you can kind of see at the top, and then it comes down, and there are all these all kinds of rich vegetation, and some oak trees. A lot of oak trees in the background. The interesting thing to me was that this place is hard to find, and it's in the midst of an abandoned industrial area. And on this side of it, let me use my pointer. On this side, right in here you can see old tires and old pieces of wood. There is this abandoned, just trashed industrial area over here. Then on the other side, about half a mile away, is a limestone processing facility. And my friend Jim, whose picture I showed you earlier, used to work there, high up on conveyors, doing repair work. I'm thinking of photographing that too and putting it, beside this, but I don't know yet. This is a little 1-acre prairie in central Illinois, and I really love this place. And these pictures need to be seen big. I doubt you can see it in here because the resolution isn't sharp enough, but when you see this larger, you can see a couple of little insects, and the red-winged blackbird up there gets big enough to see. This one, I think a good size is about 40 by 40, and then the panoramic should be at least 20 by 60, and then I've printed some about 40 by 60. Because you have to be able to move around in them. You have to be almost like you're walking through. Do you know the unicorn tapestries? So this one sort of reminds me of the unicorn tapestries. You know, all the little flowers around the unicorn and around. So I tried really hard. Most of these take me a month or 2 months to do, because I'm trying to make a picture that's interesting to look at, but that has to be balanced with being a faithful reference to the place itself. So they're hard to do, and they're fun to do. I love doing these. And so this one, there's a little park in Hyde Park where I live, where a missile site used to be. And then from 1950 to 1970, there was a Nike missile there. Presumably this was going to protect, they encircled the Lake Michigan. And but I love it that this willow tree is here. So I was trying to make a larger scene and make it more complex, and I finally abandoned that and decided I would just do this willow tree. And So every one I do, I go back to the site several times. This willow tree I've visited at least half a dozen times. But look at this bag of trash right here. And then here's this plate. I actually found the plate kind of back there, but I moved it up here in my picture. And then, and I also, I have mostly taught myself Photoshop, which means I'm not very good at it. And so I learned things, I've learned all kinds of things. So one really elementary thing I learned is that I can make the density of an image change. I'm sorry, Christina, this is so... and so I could do things like this, where I could layer it and it would be sort of translucent. But then here's the best thing. I was walking in that area, and on the sidewalk, I found this locust wing. Can you see it? So I put the locust wing in the picture. It would be there. I mean, it could be there. It wasn't actually there. It was a few blocks away. But so then the same thing happened here. So this is that dune and swale site that I showed you in the panoramic version. So this is in September. This is just, recently. And there's my friend Jim up there. And I moved a piece of junk I had photographed some of the junk in this abandoned site, and I inserted this piece right here. So I'm really trying to tell a story with these, and I'm trying to tell a story of what it means to really look closely at a place and to understand what it is and what it represents. And I'm going to end now with this one. So this is the Fent Prairie, owned by Nick and Joyce Fent. This is where I started 40 years ago, the first few pictures. And you remember the fairy ring? There it is. There's the fairy ring. So that was just, I just accidentally got there at probably the peak blooming days at the end of May. And it was such a joy because the Illinois and Indiana prairies they're so beautiful, but I don't know them as well. This was like seeing an old friend. I know the names of almost all of the plants there. The thing that's interesting is that as beautiful and pristine as it looks, it was full of biting midges, no-see-ums, which never used to be there 40 years ago. And Joyce Fent, who owns that meadow, said that she thinks it's because when she has it mowed once a year, that's all. It's never anything else has ever been done to it. She thinks it's coming in off of the mowers who come in on the wheels of their big mowing machines. So this symposium is about, in part, what can artists contribute to the coming difficult times that we're beginning to be in right now. And my contribution, I think, is to keep looking at these intact prairies. And I hope we will all remember that they're there because they contain a great deal of wisdom that we can learn from and that can help us as we move through these hard times. And we may all die out. We probably will. But when we do, so will these intact prairies. These are all here. They survive because of human protection. They're all now surrounded by commercial agriculture, other kinds of invasive weeds and species They have to be cared for by humans. So this, I think, is extremely interesting. So I hadn't seen Joyce, who owns this. I had been doing all other work. I only just went back there. This is in May. So then I went again a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't been able to reach Joyce these times when I was there. She wouldn't answer my calls. And so I went anyway. And then I went back again a couple weeks ago, and I was walking around photographing in the middle of this meadow and not paying attention to anything else. But then movement caught my eye, and I looked up, and there was this man coming towards me that I didn't know, and he didn't look happy. And I had no idea what to do. And so he came and stopped, and he said, "May I help you?" And I explained what I was doing, who I was. He said, "Does Joyce know you're here?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'm going to call her." I said, "Well, I think it'll be all right with her," because before that, all those years ago, she had given me a key to the gate, she and her husband, Nick. So he called her, and she said, "Oh, Terry, yes, come. Will you come up and see me?" So I went up to see her, and the first thing she said to me was, "How is the meadow?" She's 87 now. She's very crippled with arthritis, and she can't get there herself. And she said, "How is the meadow?" And we talked about it. We talked about particular plants. I said, "I remember in October the nodding lady's tresses bloom." She said, "Oh, yes, there's 3 kinds, And we talked about various plants. And then we talked about her husband. He was a geologist. He was a hydrologist. And he died in 2004. And she said, "We scattered his ashes on the fairy ring." Thank you.
So we have only about 5 minutes, but that's enough time for a few questions. So open it up to the audience. See if there's any questions.
Before the questions, can I just say, I don't think of these pictures I'm doing now as a requiem. I think of them more as a refuge and a repairing kind of example.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm just really impressed with the 2 factors. One is the multi-generational images that you both showed in different ways of looking at a space over time, and then the images where you had the story at the end about the prairie, you went to it 40 years ago, you came back, and then the whole idea of humanizing it, of the fact that the owner is actually on the property, gives a layer of connection that I found really profound. And then your imagery of your daughter and your mother, I was just blown away by that, because you had the previous image of you, and then you came back, and I feel profoundly rushed in our era right now. I feel like there's this rush that we have to solve some problems, and with my work, I feel a sense of urgency, and to see the power of actually taking the time, both to look at something detailed and also to look at it over time, I just found deeply profound and inspiring, and hope that I can try to integrate that more into my own work, because I think it's really helpful in terms of this idea of humanizing the narrative. So thank you both for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was wondering if you both could come into conversation around the question of, well, here, I'll approach it a different way. Like the work in which you are living in the actual but post-apocalyptic contaminated world, and, you know, how do you build survivance there, right? So the hogan, the plastic weaving, the plants, and so strategies for continuance and continuing, not in pristine, but in non-pristine. So I was hoping that could come into conversation with what you showed in some of them, but less, which is the non-pristine prairies, trees, grasses that are finding tactics to continue in these more toxic spaces. Like, you know, we know, one of the things we know is some birds are adjusting their call pitch so they can be heard over traffic, and like we see a lot of tactics that various forms of existence are testing to see if they can continue, not in a pure world, but in a presupposed more toxic world where many people are living. So I was wondering if you guys could have a little conversation about that, in which yours were more human, right? That kind of like, how do we do it? And you showed us the edge of it, but focused more on these spaces of, like, well, the actual untouched prairie. But what about those? What if your grasses were your humans? Do you photograph or think through those kind of things, and how might you guys chat about that? Like,
one way we do it is through photography, I think. I think that technology is something that's, you know, that links us somehow. It's something I think a lot about. I mean, I don't know, when I think about that, I think about genocide, and I think about, like, that's happened already, you know, that we've already lived through the apocalypse, and so I'm kind of referencing that. I think photography, I mean, one of the reasons I'm interested in historical photographic photography, because the first extant images of Navajo were shot when they were prisoners of war, essentially, at Fort Sumner after the Long Walk or something. And we just had our 150th anniversary of the treaty that enabled us to go back to our homelands. But I don't know. I don't know. I think photography is key to that. You know, playing with time, of course. You know, it's this indexical marker that, you know, it can illustrate the prairie before and after the climactic, like, transformation. So it's a wonderful tool for storytelling. I don't know if that's how you're approaching it.
Yeah, I always hope that my work is storytelling. And it's just become clear to me lately that the stories I need to tell now need to be about the ground itself. I don't have ideas about how to, my ideas at the moment are simply that we need to be looking more at these remnants that we have. And, you know, when I hear you talk, Will, I mean, the only thing comparable that I know to the genocide done to your people is what's actually been done to land itself, you know. So I think we have to begin to understand life beyond human life, or life, not beyond human life, but life in addition to human life. We need to begin to understand what plants are, how they grow, how they live. We need to understand the same about trees and every living thing. You know, I think what's interesting is that what we were hearing yesterday about what Jennifer was telling us about the parrot. You know, she was using human language but, you know, we're artists. I mean, so that's what she was using, and it was very effective. And I was talking to her today. She started that work in about 2009, that film. Most of it, I've only lately, I mean, in 40 years, when I was photographing the prairie 40 years ago, I loved it, but I didn't understand that I didn't understand the depth of what it had to teach me. You know, I didn't know its language. I still don't.
My question is for the wheel.
Right.
I think unlike the other artist presentation, I feel your presentation unique because you repeat a lot of biblical language, like apocalyptic, as you say. And I also saw your early work, like a boat. So it reminded me of paranoia. I'm not sure if you're Christian or the traditional, like Indians. So I want to know how did you ever bring your Indians, like a folklore, like a folk fairy tale, and integrate to your work, or like how the Indians they believe to environment, because I feel they're supernatural, their attitude to the environment. It's unlike the Western people like the Christianity, because they believe the supernatural, air, wind, and I don't know how you bring go up this. Have any about people tell you about a fairy tale about what our history from your old tradition, and how did you integrate that part? Because I'm not sure about, I saw your work, modern work is more like a photograph, about a model, but I want to know about how your traditional beliefs plays in your religious value, traditional Indian religious value play in your work, or you try to integrate.
I mean, I think I made one really specific reference to these hero twins in the creation story, and I thought that, you know, I think that throughout kind of the history of art, there's been a lot of kind of projects that have focused on different mythic traditions, you know, different like creation stories, and it's something that I think for me was important to embed in that work because, you know, I was thinking about different audiences and who might respond to the work. You know, because I show the work in a lot of different spaces, you know, very academic spaces like this, but that work's been shared at the Navajo Nation Museum, and one of those hogans is a, you know, it's at the Navajo Nation Zoo, and it's a, it's kind of an incubator greenhouse for pollinator species and dye plant species. I don't know, I think it's important to incorporate kind of some of those ideas. You know, they're filtered through my experience, which is, you know, I mean, I'm like a colonial subject in a lot of ways. I went to boarding school, you know, I went through the whole kind of kill the Indian, save the man process, I think on some level. And, you know, so a lot of my work is kind of, it's not eulogizing, but it's like, it's playing with those myths, but from a really kind of, I think, like I feel in some ways, you know, like I'm broken apart and I'm reaching for these different threads that I'm deriving meaning from. And, you know, I'm not totally embedded in that tradition. I'm not like my brother, you know, Benny Bighorse, who's learning all the songs and the traditions and why they're, you know, important and they actually activate like energy to heal people. Like that's not my experience. But you know, I know that stuff is real, and I believe in it, and it's true, and I try and kind of bring that, you know, as source material for the different kind of stories that I think I'm trying to weave together. I know the idea of the supernatural is something I think that's, you know, it's something that we're all talking about, or like if we're thinking about nature in a different way, or like humans' relationship to nature, or if that, you know, dichotomy is actually relevant or useful in the way that we're thinking about our existence.
Yeah. So I think we better finish up there because we have TJ Demos next. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Terry. It's great to hear from you.